David, lovely to have you on the show again. Welcome.
Thanks, Michael.
Mate, the state of Radio New Zealand at the moment, what do you make of it? Because the thing that struck me, and I just wanted to see what you thought about it, but the thing that struck me is if one allegedly digital journalist can, according to his own interview last night on Checkpoint Radio, have been doing he's been doing for the last 5 years and altering news stories to carry a pro-Russian bias, what other work is going on without Radio New Zealand to try and bend the facts to the political will of the journalist?
Well, we don't know, and the scary thing with what's transpired here is, firstly, this was not detected by Radio New Zealand. It wasn't detected by media in New Zealand. It was actually, I think, a US-based lawyer who saw this Radio New Zealand story and thought, wow, that's a bit slanted, and saw it was purported to be a Reuters story, and he actually contacted Reuters, and it's when they said, well, we never wrote that this all came to light. So the first thing is this was not detected through internal process. Second thing is, I think this is quite significant, is look, we know a lot of media are struggling financially in these times. Advertising's gone down. Private media's had revenue drops, year after year. Radio New Zealand is not one of those. Radio New Zealand and the current government had massive boosts to their funding. So you expect them of all media to actually have checking and fact-checking and a system where if a sub-editor sticks in propaganda on behalf of Putin, that someone is reviewing that and able to check. And, this should have come to light years earlier. There was actually a complaint, it turns out, about one of the stories by the person thought to be responsible, and that went nowhere. So anyone can have a rogue staffer, but really the question for Radio New Zealand is, how come you didn't have any systems to be checking this? And I can understand if it was a commercial media, because we've all heard the stories, they can't afford sub-editors anymore. But Radio New Zealand is the one entity that doesn't have advertising revenue drop off, doesn't have commercial problems, in fact, has had their revenue increase quite significantly. So, it's going to be very embarrassing, I think, when it comes out how this happened.
The head of, the chief executive of Radio New Zealand, Mr. Thompson, has had a go and said what he said. But I guess for me, this is one of those stories that as you say, if I said before, if one person can go rogue, how many others can that are not being detected on other issues?
Is he rogue? Because the reporter or digital editor in question claims he was never told not to do this. He'd been doing it for years. He thought he was just doing his job. Are there other reporters out there who think they're just doing their job too? So, it definitely, I'll give credit to Paul Thompson. I like the fact he called it garbage. He called it propaganda. He didn't try to sort of use weasel words. He's clearly very embarrassed by this. But it's going to need a lot of reassurance going forward that this isn't a more widespread problem. And, this is the most egregious one you can think of. I think it strikes a chord because this is like propaganda effectively, or spin on behalf of the Kremlin, which, doesn't have a lot of sympathy here. But you recently saw where Stuff was criticised by the Media Council over their coverage of trans issues, and Stuff's response was, the science is settled over the safety of puberty blockers, etc., in children, so there's no need for us to report anyone who disagrees. Now, yesterday, the British National Health Service just banned the use of these treatments except for research purposes because they say the science isn't settled. So there you've got another example where there's an editorial line saying, we're not going to cover this issue fairly because we've made our mind up on this, even if the Media Council tells us we're not being balanced.
Yeah, Yeah, and that's the other part of this that strikes me as odd. But going back on the David, on the Radio New Zealand, is there a feeling amongst National Party people that you are aware of that Radio New Zealand has a political bias anyhow?
Oh, absolutely. Bias could be a slightly harsh word, but the nickname is Red Radio, and most public broadcasters are left-leaning, and there's a sort of simple incentive reason for this, is if you're totally funded by the government, parties that promise more spending, more taxation, result in more funding for you. So, it's not difficult to imagine the incentive this creates when you're totally dependent on the government for funding, that you're more sympathetic to, well, everyone should just pay more tax so we can do a better job with our work. It also related to that is, we've talked about this before, most journalists tend to be left-leaning too. There was the World of Journalism study found, I think, 5-to-1 is the ratio of left-leaning journalists in New Zealand to right-leaning journalists. So you combine those two things, and you do definitely get a skew in coverage. I don't think it's deliberate bias. I think it's just different worldviews, where there's people who just can't actually understand why some people think it's good to have a lower tax economy. That means you get more economic growth. So when you've got no sympathy for an argument, you don't tend to report so favourably on it.
There's also something else I was just talking about today, and that was journalists aren't paid a lot of money. I was just making the comparison between journalists and secondary school teachers, ironically. And when I look at the average journalist, starting journalist, and then the average salary, and compare them with school teachers, secondary school teachers, they're actually under that same amount of money. And of course, they don't get 12 weeks holiday a year either, and a whole series of, journalist-only days. So is there a resentment, do you think, amongst journalists from those who earn money?
It's possible. I'm not sure I'd call it a resentment, but it does tend to mean that, again, journalists aren't necessarily representative of the wider population. We've been debating the last couple of days the Green Party's tax policy, and it's one where almost every journalist in New Zealand will benefit from that tax policy. So is that likely to then impact how they report on it? Yes, it probably is, because actually one of the things about tax policy is everyone thinks other people should pay more tax. No one thinks they should pay more tax.
But also I've noticed in the last 48, 72 hours as well, Christopher Luxon being very much the target of state-funded Television One, News and Current Affairs, and also of Radio New Zealand. There's three incidents in particular. One, there was the more babies remark, which was somehow regarded as an anti-abortion rift. Then there was the you own 7 homes, so how can you possibly understand anything? And then there was yesterday the whiny inward New Zealand remark in the release of the National Party's emissions policy. Those three incredibly minor off-cuff remarks have suddenly assumed an attack identity, particularly with Television One News and with Radio New Zealand News. Why would that be?
Well, it's appalling. I think the one especially that is beyond the pale and there should be an apology for is the one over we should have more babies, where it was discussing immigration settings and that you need immigration because your population's not replacing itself. And we should all have more babies. It wasn't a policy, it wasn't a speech, it wasn't a direction. And for those who don't know, a TVNZ reporter then questioning the deputy leader of the National Party on it, asked if they're aware of the German policy. I've forgotten the name of the policy, but it was the eugenics policy where Hitler and Himmler were encouraging only one race, Aryans, to have more babies. They were kidnapping children It was about racial purity. And to take a quip from the Leader of the Opposition and turn it into, aren't you promoting Nazi-style eugenics, is beyond the pale. It's something you would expect from a sort of very rabid troll on Twitter, not from Television New Zealand political reporter. The only redeeming feature is they didn't actually, I believe, show it on air. But to even have the question asked at a press stand-up, I think it's appalling. And then you add on the other two where, yes, these things are being blown. I think the one about, Luxon owning 7 homes, I don't think it's that many. This has been known about for the last 3 years because he declares them every year correctly. And the suspicion is this is distracting from Michael Wood because, yes, he only had 13,000 of Transrail shares, which isn't a lot, not Transrail, Auckland Airport, but he's in trouble because no one knew about them. He didn't disclose them and he didn't sell them when he got told to. So it's what you expect the Labour Research Unit to do. It's their job to say, we're in trouble, let's create a distraction, let's do our look, they're just as bad moment. But whether reporters should be playing along and say, well, because Michael Wood's in trouble over his shares, we now need to tell everyone that Christopher Luxon has more than one house. Yeah, it is the reason why people on the centre-right do have, and this is again around the world, in almost every country, people on the centre-right have very low levels of trust in the media because they do play games like this.
Journalist who asked the question, the Television New Zealand journalist was Kushla Norman, and what she said, or asked Nicola Willis, is Christopher Luxon aware of Lebensborn and Hitler's experiment on this? And then Nicola Willis says, can I be extremely clear to you, the National Party does not have a policy that we want to encourage women to change their decisions about their family size or change guidance to men for all that matter either, and to suggest otherwise is ridiculous. Kushla Norman, any relationship to the former Green Party leader, Russell Norman?
I have no idea, actually. I'm unaware of that. I will say I don't think people. There's a number of people who've been, siblings or related to MPs and former MPs. Audrey Young's brother is the former National MP, Jonathan Young. I don't think affects it. So I don't know in this case. I've not seen anything of Chris's before that's caused me outrage like this has. So I don't. Not at all suggesting there's some pattern here, but I actually can't understand how, if you're a political journalist, you can think that's an appropriate question to ask a politician in New Zealand. Oh, isn't this like what the Nazis were doing? It's just preposterous. And I don't know what went wrong, why that didn't clear her internal filter as a very stupid thing to ask.
Okay, now heading in, we've got 4 months until the election. There's going to be heightened sensitivity of the relationship between media and politicians and media and political parties anyway. One of the things that I've noticed every night on every issue is the editorialising, the opining of an individual journalist, usually not very bright, on reporting a simple media story. For example, might be the National Party's release of the emissions policy, the agricultural emissions policy yesterday. Are we going to get more of that, or are we actually going to be able to make up our own mind without being instructed?
No, we lost that a long time ago, sadly. If you go back 20 years, 90% of political news stories were substantive, where it was just the government has released a policy, here's reaction from some other people, no telling you what you think about it. Now what is, as you say, is there's always a take from the journalist, so they're both reporting the news and commenting on it at the same stage. And the other thing you've seen is very few stories now are actually policy stories. They're almost all process stories. It's about who did well in the House today, scandals, gaffes, etc. So I did a study one election, and 92% of stories were process, not policies. Policies affect New Zealanders' lives. It's policies that you're meant to vote for to say this is the sort of New Zealand I want. So again, this is why people have tuned out of the media. I used to, when I worked in Parliament, Michael, I'm the person who actually got 2 televisions put in the bar so we could watch both 6 o'clock newses. Now, I haven't watched the television news for 4 or 5 years. I just have no interest in it. Partly it's the internet where I can find out during the day what's happening. And it's the same with newspapers too. I used to, again, when I worked in the National Leaders Office, they tried to cut off our daily newspapers. And there was an outcry. Each of us had to have our own newspaper. It was so important. Now, even if I'm in a cafe waiting for my coffee and there's a newspaper there, I won't pick it up. Because I just have no interest in there. I do have interest in individual stories. I'll go online and read stuff which I think is interesting. But I'm not going to sort of let them choose for me what information I need to know. I'll go choose my own information.
Okay, well, that's sad, really, isn't it, at the end of the day? And that probably accounts for the fractionated nature of news, that you've got no single source of truth, have we, David?
No, and it is also a concern because I certainly check out stories which I agree with and which I disagree with, etc. But because people can't rely on the media to a large degree for a sort of neutral take on things, just information, is people can get into their own rabbit holes where they'll just get their news from their Facebook page or their Telegraph signals, etc. And you lose the ability to be confronted with ideas you don't agree with. And so it is not good, but I really don't know how you turn it around very easily because it is part of a global trend of just less and less trust in media.
No, it's sad. Thank you, David. Oh, by the way, polls. We talked about this last time. You said, there'll be a poll coming out on Friday. There haven't been any polls since we last chatted, I think, which was about this time last week. When are you expecting polls to be released?
No, we released on Saturday. It was slightly delayed. And Curia Taxpayer Union poll came out Saturday, and there were 2 big interesting things there. Overall, it still showed a very slim margin for the centre-right, 62 seats to 58. But the 2 things that were noticeable for me was, one, that Chris Hipkins' favourability slipped for the 4th month in a row. Still much more popular than anyone else. He's at plus 19%, but he was at plus 33%. And I think it's all these scandals, the Michael Wood stuff, etc., as part of that. But the other thing that very struck me was the support for ACT, especially in certain areas. They're at around 12-13% overall, but with male voters, 1 in 5 men are now voting ACT. In rural New Zealand, they're almost at 30% of the vote. So ACT, have the potential to keep growing. They're at 13%. I would not be surprised if before the election they even end up polling 15% or higher. So there was a huge change in the poll, but the 2 clear things for me were ACT continued to do very well, and that Hipkins' honeymoon is starting to slide.
Just on that ACT one, I agree with you. I live, as you know, in central Otago. Well, it's not representative of New Zealand, obviously, but in conversations that I would have, that pretty much bears out what you're just saying now. I'm interested if ACT could become the rural party of New Zealand.
I think there is a definite possibility that there could be a permanent, so it's a bit too early to say, and you may have noted that National have recently released agricultural emissions policy, which is more sympathetic to the farming community than previously.
Yeah.
So they're trying to be competitive there, but we won't know for a couple of months whether it will be enough. Now, in one sense, as long as the votes are still on the centre-right, that still helps the centre-right get into government. But National has been the party of the rural sector and the farming community effectively for a very long time, and they certainly won't want to
surrender
be giving that up. And you've also got Winston there too. He's always does better with rural New Zealand than there. But so Winston at his height with rural New Zealand was sort of probably at 15%, etc., 16 maybe. Round Act, as I say, getting close to 30% in some areas. If they keep that up come the election, they aren't going to be dropping down to 5 or 6% in the polls anytime soon.
Two quick questions.
New
Zealand. Yeah. Well, that's right. And they seem to be doing a pretty good job of internal order at the moment. They're doing a very good job in comparison to others. Just very quick questions. New Zealand First. It's got 4 months to go. They haven't started campaign. Well, no, they've been around the country and stuff like that. Do you actually see them troubling the 5%? That's the first question. Second question. The anti-vax, anti-mandate movement, which seems slightly dispersed at the moment between Democracy New Zealand, Brian Tamaki's lot, the Freedom of Outdoors and stuff like that. First of all, can New Zealand First get to 5% really on the basis of your polling sampling at the moment? And two, what is the maximum that anti-vax, anti-mandate can get, do you think, at the election?
With New Zealand First, I believe they've got a better chance of making 5% than last election, but I won't put the odds at over 50-50. So I think it's more likely than not they won't make it, but they're in a better position than last time. Some polls, we've had them up at 4% or so. I think their support is very dependent on how well Winston has been getting into the media. What would work for them ideally is a public poll showing them at 4% around August, because if you achieve that, then the media will report on them more, they become relevant. People will think, well, if I vote for them, it's not a wasted vote. Their biggest challenge is probably ACT, though, because they are competing to some degree, similar policies on co-governance, similar policies on climate change, rural emissions, etc., and that New Zealand First still, for some people, are the ones who put Jacinda into power. So, if ACT weren't there and doing so well, I think it would be very likely. I think if Jacinda had stayed Prime Minister, they would probably be doing better too, because Winston, I think, was becoming quite a foil to her, sort of calling her out, etc. And you've got the same problem for the anti-vax party. If Jacinda had stayed Prime Minister, they would have been tuning up to every public meeting she held with protests and making the news, etc., because they were highly motivated personally against her, because they saw her as taking away their freedoms personally. Hipkins doesn't really attract that level of antipathy. So that's one issue. The second is that they're stupid. As in, there are, I think, 4 separate anti-vax parties. A couple of them have formed together. You've got the Tamakis, you've got the Sue Greys, you've got Matt King's lot. Plus you've got New Zealand First, which actually has been fairly hostile to the vaccine mandates too. And you've got the New Conservatives, who have their own brand. So you've actually got 5, 6 parties there, all saying, look, we were against the vaccine mandate, but none of them are going to make 5% unless there was some sort of merger. I do think if they had merged earlier with one leader, they would have a reasonable chance of making 5%. The media don't cover them at all, but Matt King and Leighton Baker, who's also, I think he set up his own party too, They get 2, 3, sometimes even 4% for third Prime Minister. Matt King gets 300 people to public meetings. So there's still not a huge number, but certainly over 5% of New Zealanders who still feel very aggrieved by that and might vote accordingly. But with so many parties splitting the vote, I think this could be one of the highest elections for wasted vote. New Zealand First gets 3.5, 4, Conservatives 2, Top 3, the vaccine mandate parties 3.5% between them. You might have 12% or so of the vote being wasted.
Yeah, that's the irony, isn't it? They want to change the government. They hate the government more than they hate anybody else, but they'll end up wasting their votes anyhow.
Yes, absolutely. You need to be strategic and tactical on this. So if that's your motivating factor, you really want to be looking at those polls closer to the election and deciding, well, which is the one best able to represent me in Parliament. But the trouble is people won't do that. What they should have done, and they've tried to do, but the personalities means they've fallen out with each other, is some sort of merger alliance where there was one clear brand for them to stand on.
Thank you very much, David. It has been a pleasure to talk to you, as it usually is. You have a very good week, my friend.
Thank you.
Okay, that's David Farrar. He is probably New Zealand's leading pollster now. He used to work in the Prime Minister's office, John Key's office, in actual fact, for a wee while. His politics are very much centre-right. More centre than right, actually, you'd have to say. But he did set up this really, really good polling agency. I think the Taxpayers Union are involved with it as well. At least they fund it as well. And they do this poll. And they, without question, are the most accurate for the last 2 elections they've predicted prior the election. So that's why they have significant credibility, ironically, with the mainstream media as well.